Beneath the quiet fields beside the Mississippi lies the remains of a forgotten capital that once may have been larger than medieval London. Thousands lived among towering earthen monuments, vast ceremonial plazas, and crowded neighborhoods. Then the city began to empty, leaving behind no written explanation and not even its original name. What happened to Cahokia, and why was one of ancient North America's greatest cities almost erased from history before we uncover its story? Please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more forgotten worlds, vanished civilizations, and mysteries from the human past. At first light, the ground east of the Mississippi appears almost empty. Mist gathers in the low fields of southern Illinois. Traffic murmurs along roads built for a modern suburb, and long grass bends across broad, rounded hills that seem too smooth to be natural and too quiet to be important. There are no broken marble columns rising from the soil, no roofless palaces, no carved gate announcing that a capital once stood here. A visitor can cross the landscape without realizing that beneath the lawns, fields, parking areas, and highway embankments lie the remains of the greatest indigenous city ever built north of Mexico before European colonization. The place is known today as Cahokia, although that was almost certainly not the name used by the people who created it. Its original name has disappeared, along with the language spoken in its busiest streets and the titles of those who governed from its monumental center. What remains is the land itself, shaped into enormous platforms, ridges, plazas, and buried neighborhoods by human hands nearly 1,000 years ago. The silence is deceptive because this was not a scattered village enlarged by modern imagination. At its height in the 11th and 12th centuries, the greater Cahokian settlement stretched across thousands of acres and contained perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 inhabitants. Though scholars still debate the exact number and the boundaries of the urban population, some estimates rise higher when nearby communities on both sides of the Mississippi are included. Even the more cautious figures place Cahokia among the major population centers of its age. Medieval London may have held a similar number of people during parts of the same period, and Cahokia may briefly have been larger. The comparison is imperfect, because ancient populations cannot be counted with the precision of a modern census, but it exposes the scale of what has been forgotten. While stone churches and royal fortresses were rising across Europe, an immense city of timber and earth was gathering people, food, labor, ritual, and political power beside the Mississippi. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Cahokia deserves attention not because it fits an old fantasy of a lost civilization, but because it overturns a familiar story about the continent itself. Generations of popular history described pre-colonial North America as a nearly untouched wilderness, occupied only by small mobile groups. That picture was always false. The continent held farming towns, trade corridors, engineered landscapes, ceremonial centers, defensive works, and societies capable of coordinating thousands of people. Cahokia does not stand alone in that deeper history, yet its size makes it especially difficult to ignore. It was an urban experiment on a continental scale, built centuries before Columbus crossed the Atlantic and long before any European-founded city in what became the United States approached its peak population. The clearest surviving statement of Cahokia's power is Monk's Mound, a vast earthen platform rising above the plain. From a distance it resembles a natural hill with flattened terraces, but every major contour was formed through repeated construction. Soil was dug from nearby borrow pits, loaded into baskets, carried by hand, and deposited in carefully arranged layers. No draft animals hauled the earth. No wheeled carts moved it. The mound's enormous mass represents countless journeys made by human bodies, each basket adding only a small amount to a structure that eventually towered over the settlement. From its summit, the ancient city would have spread in every direction: open plazas, smaller mounds, rows of houses, workshops, storage places, paths, cultivated land, smoke from cooking fires, and the movement of thousands of residents. Today, much of that view has been interrupted by roads, power lines, warehouses, and the distant skyline of St. Louis. Yet the height still gives a sense of command. This was a place designed to be seen. Only a fraction of Cahokia's original monumental landscape survives. Archaeologists generally estimate that the city once contained around 120 earthen mounds of different forms and purposes. Some supported buildings, some marked burials, some created ceremonial stages or boundaries. Many were flattened after Euro-American settlement as fields were ploughed, streets extended, factories built, and earthworks treated as convenient piles of fill across the river. St. Louis itself was once famous enough for its ancient earthworks to be called the Mound City, but nearly all of those mounds were destroyed during urban expansion. The loss is difficult to visualize because destruction removed not merely individual monuments, but the relationships between them. A mound standing alone can look like an isolated curiosity. 100 mounds arranged around plazas and neighborhoods reveal a planned world. Cahokia Mounds. Org. https. Cahokia Mounds. Org. Testasorsi.com. That difference explains part of Cahokia's long disappearance from public memory. Stone ruins remain visibly ancient even after their builders are gone. Earth architecture is easier to mistake for nature, and timber buildings leave little above ground once posts rot and roofs collapse. A city made primarily from soil, wood, fibre, thatch, clay, and lived human space can vanish without being truly erased. Its foundations survive as dark stains in the ground. Its walls become lines of post holes. Its houses appear as patterns of burned clay, storage pits, hearths, and scattered objects. Entire neighborhoods can lie beneath a modern field while the surface gives no sign of them. Archaeology must recover the city indirectly. Reading changes in soil color and density as carefully as another historian might read ink on parchment. The evidence remains incomplete, and every reconstruction contains uncertainty. Population estimates depend on assumptions about how many houses stood at one time, how many people occupied each household, and which surrounding settlements belong to the urban system. The dates of construction are refined as new samples are tested. The uses of individual mounds are reconsidered when excavations reveal unexpected burials, buildings, or rebuilding episodes. Even the word capital requires care. Cahokia was clearly a dominant ceremonial and political centre, but there is no surviving written constitution, royal list, or administrative archive explaining how authority operated. Its leaders may not have ruled through institutions that resemble European kingdoms. The city must be understood on its own terms, even when those terms cannot be fully recovered. Its modern name adds another layer of confusion. Cahokia comes from a native community encountered in the region by the French many centuries after the ancient metropolis had declined. There is no evidence that the people called Cahokia built the city, and the name does not restore the identity of its founders. It is a label placed over an absence. That absence has sometimes encouraged claims that the builders were a mysterious vanished race disconnected from native peoples. Such ideas were never supported by serious evidence, and often served a convenient colonial purpose if the mounds belonged to some imaginary lost population. Settlers could admire the monuments while denying the achievements and land histories of the indigenous nations. Archaeology now situates Cahokia firmly within the Mississippian world and within the long histories of native North America. Descendant nations and indigenous communities continue to regard the wider mound landscape as culturally significant, even when the precise lines of ancestry remain complex, and scholars debate how particular historic peoples relate to the city's population. To call Cahokia forgotten, then, requires qualification. It was not forgotten in the same way by everyone. Indigenous memory, ceremony, place knowledge, and political history did not simply vanish because Euro-American textbooks failed to include them. What disappeared most completely was Cahokia's position in the dominant story told about America, a story that began too late, treated cities as imported achievements, and imagined complexity arriving from across the Atlantic. The mounds stood in plain sight while that story was repeated around them. Farmers ploughed their slopes, roads cut through settlement zones, houses and businesses rose over ancient precincts. The largest city of its time in this part of the continent became background scenery. Yet the ground kept its record. Beneath the grass are the traces of walls, feasts, fires, graves, workshops, and rebuilding. Pollen and seeds preserve fragments of the plants people cultivated and consumed. Broken pottery carries patterns once chosen by human hands. Human teeth retain chemical evidence of distant childhood landscapes. Layers of earth reveal moments when monuments were enlarged, abandoned, or transformed. Nothing survives as a complete explanation. But the fragments agree on one essential point: this was a true metropolis, deliberately created and sustained by people whose organizational power was immense. Standing before Monk's Mound today, the mystery is not how anyone could have overlooked such a large hill. The deeper mystery is how an entire city could remain absent from the historical imagination, while its central monument still dominated the horizon. Cahokia was never hidden in a jungle or buried beneath desert sand. It was hidden by assumptions about what a city should be made from, what indigenous societies were believed capable of building, and where the history of North America was supposed to begin. To recover it, the first task is not to search for a vanished continent or a legendary race. It is simply to look again at the ordinary ground beside the Mississippi and recognize that the quiet hills are architecture, the open fields are former neighborhoods, and the empty horizon once held a population large enough to rival one of medieval Europe's best-known capitals. Long before the Great Mound dominated the horizon, the Mississippi floodplain was already teaching people how to live with abundance and uncertainty. The region surrounding Cahokia is known as the American Bottom, a broad stretch of low, fertile land lying between the river and the bluffs of present-day Illinois. To modern eyes, it can appear flat and exposed, but its apparent simplicity conceals a constantly changing environment. Rivers shifted course. Seasonal floods spread fresh sediment across the plain, marshes formed and disappeared, backwater lakes filled with fish, turtles, waterfowl, and aquatic plants. Beyond them stood forests of oak, hickory, walnut, and pecan, while patches of prairie opened beneath an enormous sky. The landscape offered almost everything a community might need, yet it never offered it without risk. A settlement built too close to water could be flooded. A channel that supplied fish one generation might become clogged with silt in the next. The people who eventually created Cahokia inherited centuries of knowledge about how to read these changes. Human communities had occupied the wider Mississippi Valley for thousands of years before anything resembling a city appeared. Hunting, fishing, gathering, and seasonal movement shaped life through much of that long past. People followed deer through forests, collected nuts in autumn, harvested wild plants, and returned repeatedly to favored river terraces and lake edges. These were not aimless wanderings across an empty wilderness. Familiar routes connected places of food, stone, ceremony, burial, and social gathering. Knowledge of the landscape accumulated slowly, held not in written maps but in memory, custom, and repeated practice. Even before permanent villages became common, communities were already transforming their surroundings by burning vegetation, encouraging useful plants, and selecting where particular species would thrive. Over time, groups in the eastern woodlands began tending and cultivating native plants. Long before maize became dominant, people grew species such as sunflower, squash, goosefoot, maygrass, knotweed, and sumpweed. Some of these plants would barely be recognized as crops today, yet they formed part of a sophisticated agricultural tradition developed independently in North America. Seeds became larger through generations of selection. Growing areas were cleared and managed. Harvests were processed, stored, and shared. Farming did not arrive as a sudden invention that instantly replaced hunting and gathering. It emerged gradually, mixed with older ways of obtaining food, creating a flexible economy suited to a river landscape where no single resource could always be trusted. By the early centuries of the first millennium, woodland period communities were building burial mounds, producing distinctive pottery, participating in long-distance exchange, and gathering at ceremonial centers. These societies were not simply incomplete versions of the urban world that followed. They had their own political arrangements, beliefs, and social rhythms. Their monuments demonstrate the ability to coordinate labor well before Cahokia's rise, while objects made from copper, shell, mica, and exotic stone reveal connections extending across great distances. Ideas traveled with those materials. Styles of ceremony, treatment of the dead, and expressions of authority moved between communities, changed locally, and sometimes disappeared. What survives in the archaeological record suggests a landscape filled with interaction rather than isolated villages. The American Bottom became increasingly attractive as agriculture intensified. Its soils were rich, water was abundant, and several ecological zones lay within a short journey. A family could cultivate crops on elevated ground, fish in nearby lakes, hunt in forests, and gather plants from wetlands and prairies. Rivers also acted as the roads. Canoes could carry people and goods more efficiently than overland travel, linking the region to the Missouri's Ohio, Illinois, and Mississippi river systems. Cahokia would later benefit enormously from this position. But the roots existed before the metropolis. Generations of travelers already moved through the valley, exchanging raw materials, marriage partners, stories, rituals, and news. Maize eventually altered the balance. Originally domesticated far to the south in Mexico, it spread northward over many centuries and entered eastern North America long before becoming the foundation of large-scale village life. Early varieties did not immediately transform society. They had to be adapted to different growing seasons and combined with existing foods. By roughly the late first millennium, however, maize cultivation was expanding in the central Mississippi Valley. Its productivity offered a powerful advantage. Large harvests could feed concentrated populations, support seasonal ceremonies, and create surpluses that might be stored or controlled. Yet dependence on maize also introduced vulnerability. A crop that could nourish thousands could fail under drought, flood, pests, or political disruption. The same food that helped make Cahokia possible would later become part of the pressures faced by its inhabitants. Before the urban transformation, the region contained numerous small settlements rather than one dominant centre. Houses were generally built from wooden posts, reeds, clay, and thatch. Families lived near fields and storage pits, repairing or rebuilding structures as materials decayed. Smoke from hearths settled into roofs. Dogs moved between houses. Corn, seeds, meat, fish, and nuts were cooked in ceramic vessels or roasted over fires. Tools were made from stone, bone, shell, and wood. Life followed seasonal demands: planting, fishing runs, gathering, harvesting, hunting, construction, and ceremony. The villages were not crowded cities, but neither were they temporary camps. They were stable communities rooted in specific places. Archaeologists sometimes describe the period before Cahokia's explosive growth as if the city were waiting to happen. Yet no outcome was inevitable. Fertile land alone does not create a metropolis. Rivers do not automatically produce kings, plazas, or monuments. Many regions possessed rich resources without developing anything comparable. Something changed around the turn of the 11th century, but the evidence remains incomplete. Population may have been increasing. Maize production may have become more reliable. New religious ideas may have attracted people to particular ceremonies. Ambitious leaders may have reorganized labor and settlement. Migrants may have arrived with unfamiliar traditions. No single explanation fully accounts for the speed and scale of what followed. The earlier villages nevertheless provided the essential foundation. Their inhabitants understood the floodplain, maintained food networks, built houses suited to local materials, and participated in social systems extending beyond individual settlements. They knew how to organize communal work and how to turn earth into sacred architecture. Cahokia did not rise from emptiness. It grew from a populated, remembered, and carefully managed world. Then, within only a few generations, that world was rearranged. Small communities were abandoned or absorbed. New neighborhoods appeared. Open spaces were cleared on an enormous scale. Mounds began to rise where ordinary houses had once stood. People gathered from near and far around a newly created center, and the familiar floodplain became the stage for one of the most dramatic urban transformations in ancient North America. Around the middle of the 11th century, the American bottom changes with astonishing speed. What had been a landscape of villages, fields, wetlands, and modest ceremonial centers is reorganized around a single expanding place. Houses appear in dense clusters. Older settlements are abandoned or reduced. Large areas are cleared. New plazas are laid out. Mounds begin to rise in deliberate relation to one another. And the population gathers so rapidly that archaeologists often describe the transformation as Cahokia's Big Bang. The phrase is modern, but it captures the suddenness visible in the ground. Sometime around 1050, Cahokia stops behaving like an ordinary regional settlement and becomes something unprecedented. The change is not merely a matter of gradual growth. Many ancient towns expanded as children established homes beside their parents. and neighborhoods slowly spread outward. Cahokia appears to have grown through a more concentrated act of reorganization. Buildings were removed from areas that became public spaces. Residential zones were planned around ceremonial precincts. Construction occurred on a scale requiring coordinated labor, stored food, leadership, and a shared willingness or obligation to participate. The city seems to have been remade according to a new vision of how people, monuments, and sacred space should fit together. At the center of this transformation was an enormous open area now called the Grand Plaza. Creating it required more than choosing an empty field. Parts of the ground were low and uneven, shaped by old channels and natural depressions. Soil had to be moved and surfaces leveled. Houses that once occupied sections of the area were cleared away. The result was a vast public space capable of holding large gatherings, ceremonies, games, markets, political assemblies, or performances whose exact character is no longer known. Scholars still debate how the plaza was used at different times, but its size makes one thing clear: Cahokia's builders expected crowds. Around that open center, the settlement expanded into a dense urban landscape. Estimates vary, as they must for a city without surviving census records. But Cahokia itself may have contained 10,000 or more people at its height, while the wider complex of nearby settlements may have supported 15,000 to 20,000, perhaps more. These numbers placed it among the largest cities in the world north of Mexico at the time, in parts of the 11th century. Its population may have rivaled or exceeded that of London. The comparison should not be treated as an exact contest between two distant places, yet it remains useful because it challenges the instinct to imagine medieval Europe as urban and North America as empty. The people filling Cahokia did not all come from the immediate neighborhood. Later evidence from human remains suggests that many residents had grown up elsewhere. Some may have arrived from nearby river valleys, while others traveled much farther. Their migration would have transformed the city into a meeting place of different accents, customs, food traditions, kinship systems, and ritual practices. This diversity will become one of Cahokia's defining features. But even in the city's earliest expansion, it raises an essential question: what drew so many people to the same place at nearly the same time? Food alone cannot explain it. The fertile floodplain could support large harvests, but rich soil existed before 1050. Trade routes also predated the city. Something more powerful appears to have been operating, perhaps a new religious movement, a political alliance, a cycle of ceremonies, or the rise of leaders able to combine spiritual authority with control over labor and surplus. The evidence remains incomplete because Cahokia's people left no known written account of the event. Archaeologists must infer motivation from settlement patterns, buildings, objects, burials, and the timing of construction. One intriguing clue comes from imagery and ritual traditions associated with the wider Mississippian world, symbols connected to fertility, warfare, celestial forces, ancestors, and the renewal of life appear across distant regions. Cahokia may have become the center of a powerful new religious order that promised stability, abundance, or cosmic balance. If people believed the city stood at a sacred center of the world, migration there may have felt less like moving to a larger village and more like entering a transformed social universe. Political ambition and religious conviction were probably not separate forces. Leaders who organized ceremonies could also organize labor, tribute, food, and alliances. The timing may also have mattered. Around the year 1054, a supernova appeared in the sky, bright enough to be visible during the day for a time. Some researchers have wondered whether this extraordinary celestial event influenced Cahokian beliefs or ceremonies. No direct evidence proves that it triggered the city's rise, and the major transformation may already have been underway. Still, ancient people across the world watched the sky closely, and such an event would have been difficult to ignore. Whether interpreted as an omen, a warning, or a sign of renewal, it may have entered a cultural moment already charged with change. The city's expansion required practical decisions as much as spiritual ones. Timber had to be cut for houses, walls, public buildings, and ritual structures. Fields had to produce enough maize and other foods for people who were increasingly concentrated in one place. Water had to be obtained from nearby streams, springs, lakes, and the river environment. Waste had to be managed, paths maintained, and construction timed around planting and harvest. None of this proves the existence of a centralized state in the modern sense, but it does suggest an authority capable of persuading or compelling large numbers of people to work toward common designs. The pace of construction must have changed the experience of the landscape. A person returning after several years might have found familiar houses gone, old paths blocked, and new earthworks rising over former residential ground. Trees would have disappeared from heavily used areas, smoke would have hung above clusters of dwellings, canoes would have arrived carrying food, stone, shell, timber, and visitors. Ceremonial gatherings may have brought thousands into the plaza, creating noise and movement unlike anything previously known in the region. Cahokia's transformation also affected surrounding communities. Some settlements became smaller as people moved inward. Others grew into satellite centres linked to the new metropolis. Farmers living beyond the dense core may have supplied food or labour. Smaller mound centres emerged within the wider network, suggesting a hierarchy of places connected to Cahokia's influence. The city was not an isolated island of population, but the heart of a reorganised regional system. What survives in the record suggests that this system was created deliberately, though not necessarily peacefully or by universal agreement. Some people may have come willingly, attracted by ceremony, opportunity, protection, marriage, or trade. Others may have faced pressure from powerful leaders or changing alliances. Rapid urbanization always creates winners and losers, even when the details remain invisible. The same concentration that generated wealth and spectacle also increased dependence on those who controlled land, food, ritual access, and public labour. By the late 11th century, the transformation was unmistakable. Cahokia had become more than a settlement and more than a ceremonial gathering place. It was a metropolis built from earth and timber, drawing people into a new political and sacred order. Its rise had taken only a few generations, yet it already carried the weight of a capital. The next challenge was to give that power permanent form, to turn open ground into planned space, human labour into monuments, and the flat floodplain into a city whose architecture could make authority visible from miles away. Once Cahokia begins to grow, the floodplain itself becomes construction material. The city's builders do not quarry limestone or raise walls from cut blocks. They work with soil, timber, clay, grass, reeds, and the strength of human bodies. What looks modest in material becomes monumental in scale. Earth is dug from pits, loaded into baskets, carried across the settlement, and emptied in carefully chosen places. Layer after layer is added until platforms rise above the plain. Plazas spread across levelled ground, and entire neighbourhoods are arranged around ceremonial spaces. The city is not built upon the landscape so much as built from it. This method demands extraordinary labour. A single basket of earth may weigh only a few dozen pounds, yet the largest mounds contain hundreds of thousands of cubic metres of fill. Every load has to be excavated, lifted, transported, and placed without wheeled vehicles or draft animals. The work is repeated thousands upon thousands of times. Paths become deeply worn. Borrow pits expand into ponds or depressions. Workers move in lines between excavation zones and building sites. Perhaps organised by household and neighbourhood, kin group, or visiting community, archaeologists can measure the finished earthworks, but the human rhythm behind them remains largely invisible. The mounds are not simply heaps of soil. Builders understand that different earth behaves differently. Some soils drain well, others retain moisture. Certain clays become dense and stable when compacted, while loose material may slide or erode. Excavations show that fill was often placed in distinct layers, sometimes using contrasting soils gathered from separate locations. The colours may have held symbolic meaning, but they also affected stability. Construction episodes could be surprisingly rapid, yet mounds were repeatedly enlarged, resurfaced, and reshaped over decades. A monument was not necessarily completed once. It could remain a living structure, altered as political needs, ritual practices, or generations of leadership changed. The city contains several types of mound. Flat-topped platform mounds supported buildings that may have served as temples, council houses, elite residences, storage structures, or stages for public ceremony. Conical mounds often held burials. Long ridge-shaped mounds may have marked boundaries or carried meanings that are now difficult to reconstruct. Their positions mattered as much as their shapes. Mounds framed plazas, defined important sightlines, and separated spaces of different social or ceremonial importance. From ground level, they controlled movement and visibility. From their summits, leaders or ritual specialists could stand above crowds gathered below. Cahokia's planners also paid close attention to open space. The Grand Plaza was only the largest of several plazas distributed through the settlement. These were not accidental gaps between houses. They were prepared surfaces, sometimes created by filling natural depressions and removing earlier structures. Maintaining them would have required continuous effort. Grass and brush had to be cleared, water had to drain away, erosion and heavy foot traffic had to be repaired. Their openness made them useful for large gatherings, but it also made the surrounding architecture more dramatic. A mound rising beyond a wide, empty plaza appears larger and more distant than the same mound crowded by nearby buildings. Causeways and defined pathways linked important parts of the city. One known route extended southward from the central precinct toward burial and ceremonial areas. Its exact meaning remains debated, but it suggests that movement through Cahokia could be formally directed. Processions may have followed such paths. Visitors arriving for major gatherings may have entered along established approaches that gradually revealed the scale of the centre. The experience of the city was therefore not random. Its arrangement shaped what people saw first, where they could walk, and how they approached places of authority. Beyond the monuments stood thousands of houses. Most were modest rectangular structures made from upright wooden posts woven with smaller branches and covered in clay or mud plaster. Roofs were thatched with grass or reeds. A central hearth provided heat and light, while storage pits were dug into or near the floor. These houses decayed quickly in the damp climate and had to be repaired or rebuilt. Their impermanence should not be mistaken for carelessness. Timber architecture could be constructed efficiently with local materials and adapted to household needs, but it also meant that the city consumed enormous quantities of wood. Neighbourhoods appear to have been organised in clusters, sometimes around small courtyards or local public buildings. The pattern suggests communities within the metropolis, perhaps formed by extended families, migrants from the same region, craft specialists, or groups sharing ritual obligations. Scholars still debate how rigidly these districts were planned and whether all of them were occupied at the same time. What survives in the record suggests a city that mixed broad central design with constant local rebuilding. Houses shifted, fences were moved, pits were filled. New structures replaced old ones while the larger ceremonial layout remained recognizable. Timber was also used on a far greater scale. Massive posts marked circles and alignments. Large buildings crowned some mounds. Palisades eventually enclosed the central precinct. Each major project required trees to be selected, felled with stone tools, trimmed, transported, and raised. A single substantial post could demand the coordinated effort of many people. Repeated construction placed growing pressure on nearby forests, forcing workers to travel farther for suitable timber. The city's visual power depended on a widening zone of extraction beyond its inhabited core. Food had to sustain this labour. Large projects were likely timed around agricultural cycles, drawing workers when planting or harvesting demands were lower. Maize, squash, native seeds, fish, deer, and other foods could be gathered for communal meals or distributed to work parties. Feasting may have transformed labour into ceremony, reinforcing alliances and obligations. A mound-building event could have been both practical and political. People worked together, ate together, watched leaders direct activity, and saw a new monument emerge from their combined effort. Not everyone necessarily participated under the same conditions. Some labour may have been voluntary, offered as a religious duty or as part of community membership. Some may have been required by leaders who controlled access to land, food, or ceremony. Captives or socially subordinate people may also have contributed, though direct evidence is limited. No single explanation fully accounts for how Cahokia mobilized such a large workforce. The city left no payrolls, tax records, or written decrees. Its administration survives only in the scale and coordination of what was built. One lesser-known feature of this construction is how much of it remains hidden below the modern surface. Archaeologists have found that Cahokia's builders sometimes filled old gullies, channels, and uneven areas before creating plazas or residential zones. The city's apparent flatness was itself engineered. Places that now look naturally level may contain deep deposits of transported earth. The builders were not merely placing monuments upon suitable ground. They were correcting the landscape to fit a larger design. This transformation carried consequences. Borrow pits changed drainage, cleared forests increased erosion, dense housing raised the danger of fire, large gatherings strained water and food supplies. Yet during Cahokia's most ambitious years, these costs may have seemed small compared with the power of the finished city. The earthworks turned collective labour into visible authority. Every mound declared that leaders could summon workers, feed them, organise them, and persuade them to reshape the world beneath their feet. By the early 12th century, Cahokia's skyline was no longer that of a large village. Platforms rose above rooftops, plazas opened between ceremonial precincts, pathways connected spaces of gathering, burial, and rule. At the centre, one structure grew larger than all the rest, absorbing staggering quantities of earth and dominating the floodplain. The city had learned how to make power visible, and nowhere was that lesson expressed more forcefully than in the enormous mound rising above its ceremonial heart. Monk's Mound rises so far above the surrounding plain that it changes the scale of everything around it. Houses that would have seemed substantial at ground level shrink beneath its terraces. Smaller mounds become satellites. The Grand Plaza opens before it like a deliberately cleared stage, and from its summit the rivers, wetlands, fields, and distant bluffs form a broad natural horizon. The structure is not simply the largest monument at Cahokia. It is the point from which the entire city appears to have been organized, a massive earthen statement that political authority, sacred order, and control over labor were concentrated in one elevated place. The mound's modern name comes from a community of Trappist monks who lived nearby in the early 19th century. Long after Cahokia's builders had disappeared from the city, its ancient name is unknown. At its base, Monk's Mound covers roughly 14 acres, making it larger in footprint than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its height is more than 30 meters, though erosion, later disturbance, and centuries of weathering have altered its original form. It was built in multiple stages rather than as a single uninterrupted project. Each enlargement changed not only the monument but the experience of the city around it. As the mound grew, its summit rose farther above ordinary life, and the people who occupied buildings there became increasingly separated from those below. Constructing it required an almost unimaginable number of individual actions. Workers cut soil from different parts of the floodplain, packed it into baskets, carried it uphill, and deposited it in planned layers. The mound contains soils of different colours and textures, suggesting that builders selected materials rather than using whatever happened to be closest. Some layers may have helped with drainage or stability. Others may have carried symbolic associations connected to particular places, waters, or directions. Scholars still debate how technical knowledge and ceremonial meaning interacted during construction, but the builders clearly understood that a monument this large could not be created by careless dumping. Even with that knowledge, Monk's Mound was difficult to control. Earth behaves slowly and sometimes unpredictably. Water infiltrates weak points, heavy rains cut channels into slopes, different soil layers settle at different rates. Sections of the mound appear to have slumped during or after construction, forcing repairs and changes in design. These failures are revealing because they show experimentation on a scale never previously attempted in the region. The builders were not following a simple inherited blueprint. They were pushing earthen architecture toward its structural limits, learning through success, damage, and reconstruction. Broad terraces divide the mound into several levels. A large ramp or stairway once provided access from the plaza side, directing movement upward. The ascent would have been physically and psychologically dramatic. A person approaching from the open plaza faced a steep artificial mountain, then climbed above the roofs and smoke of the city. The higher the visitor rose, the more the ordinary world fell away. By the time someone reached the summit, the city below would have appeared ordered into plazas, neighborhoods, mounds, and pathways. Elevation transformed authority into something visible. Those standing above could look down upon thousands, while those below saw leaders framed against the sky. At the summit stood a large timber building. Only its buried post holes remain, but their arrangement suggests an enormous structure for its time, possibly around 30 meters long. Its walls were made from wood, clay, and other perishable materials. Yet its position made it one of the most prominent buildings in North America. Archaeologists cannot say with certainty whether it served as a ruler's residence, a council house, a temple, or some combination of these functions. Modern categories may divide activities that Cahokian society treated as inseparable. A leader could have been political because he or she possessed sacred authority, and sacred authority could have depended on organizing food, warfare, ceremony, marriage, and labor. The summit building was rebuilt, just as the mound itself was enlarged. Each rebuilding may have marked the installation of a new leader, a change in ritual practice, or a renewal of the city's sacred center. Timber structures decay, but deliberate rebuilding can turn decay into part of the political cycle. The removal of an old building and erection of a new one may have demonstrated continuity, while allowing each generation to reshape the place. What survives in the record suggests that the summit was not a static throne platform, but an active precinct repeatedly renewed. From there, leaders could oversee ceremonies in the Grand Plaza. Thousands of people may have gathered below for seasonal observances, public feasts, games, dances, announcements, or rituals tied to planting and harvest. The exact events are lost, but the architectural relationship is unmistakable. Monk's Mound provides height, the plaza provides audience space. Together they create a landscape designed for spectacle. A voice from the summit would not necessarily carry across the entire plaza. So movement, costumes, smoke, banners, processions, and carefully timed actions may have communicated meaning as much as speech. The mound may also have represented a sacred mountain, a meeting point between different levels of the universe. Across many indigenous traditions of Eastern North America, landscapes and ceremonial structures could connect the world above, the human world, and powers associated with water or the world below. It would be too simple to impose any one later belief directly onto Cahokia. But the city's repeated use of height, direction, burial, water, and celestial alignment suggests a deeply ordered sacred geography. Monk's Mound stood at the center of that arrangement, raised from the earth yet reaching toward the sky. Its location near wetlands and waterways may have strengthened this symbolism. Cahokia's world was shaped by the Mississippi and its shifting channels, by seasonal floods, mist, storms, and the rich life of marshes. The mound offered apparent stability above a landscape known for change. From its summit, leaders may have presented themselves as guardians of balance between flood and field, hunger and abundance, life and death, ordinary time and ceremonial renewal. Their power depended partly on convincing people that the city's order reflected a larger cosmic order. That claim would have required constant reinforcement. A monument can inspire awe, but it can also expose inequality. The contrast between a huge summit building and modest houses below made differences in status impossible to miss. Those who occupied the mound controlled access to the city's highest and most visible space. They could receive visitors, store valued goods, direct ceremonies, and separate themselves from the crowded conditions of the lower settlement. Sacred elevation became social distance. Yet Cahokia's rulers, whoever they were, could not have built Monk's Mound alone. Its authority rested on the labor of thousands of people who carried its soil. Every terrace preserved the work of farmers, craftspeople, migrants, local families, and perhaps captives or coerced laborers. The monument celebrated centralized power, but it was physically composed of collective effort. This created a lasting tension at the heart of Cahokia. The mound demonstrated that leaders could unite a population around an extraordinary project, while also revealing how much they demanded from that population. For a time, the arrangement held. The great mound anchored the city, the summit building overlooked the plaza, and ceremonial authority flowed outward through the planned landscape. But below that elevated center, most Cahokians lived close to the ground, among hearth smoke, storage pits, crowded houses, workshops, animals, food remains, mud, and the constant labor required to keep a metropolis alive. The monumental view from above suggested order. Daily life below would reveal how complicated, diverse, and fragile that order truly was. Below the summit of Monk's Mound, Cahokia lives at the level of smoke, mud, food, noise, and constant repair. The Grand Plaza may appear empty in modern reconstructions, a broad ceremonial space surrounded by monuments, but during the city's height it would rarely have felt isolated from ordinary life. Houses crowded the surrounding districts. Footpaths converged on the central precinct. Workers carried baskets of soil, bundles of firewood, pots of grain, fish from nearby waters, and hides taken from deer. Dogs moved between dwellings, scavenging scraps and following familiar people. Smoke rose from hundreds of hearths and settled over the low ground, especially during cold or windless mornings. Cahokia's monumental centre projected order, yet its survival depended on thousands of small tasks performed every day. Most residents lived in rectangular houses built around wooden frames. Upright posts formed the walls, smaller branches filled the spaces between them, and clay plaster helped block wind and rain. Roofs were covered with thatch, creating structures that could be warm and serviceable but remained vulnerable to fire, rot, insects, and storms. A single household might occupy a building only for a limited number of years before replacing it nearby, as generations rebuilt. Older post holes disappeared beneath new floors, producing dense archaeological patterns that reveal neighborhoods repeatedly renewed rather than permanently fixed. Inside, the hearth was the center of domestic life. It provided warmth, light, and a place for cooking, but it also filled the enclosed space with smoke. Openings in the roof allowed some of it to escape, though soot would still darken wooden beams and cling to thatch. People slept on mats, hides, or raised platforms, surrounded by tools, baskets, pottery, stored food, and personal objects. Privacy was limited. Household members worked, ate, rested, and sheltered together in a confined space, while voices and movement from neighbouring homes remained close. Food preparation consumed much of the day. Maize had become increasingly important, but Cahokians did not live on corn alone. Women and men cultivated squash, sunflower, and other plants while continuing to gather wild fruits, nuts, and edible greens. Fish came from lakes, streams, and river channels. Deer provided meat, hides, bone, sinew, and antler. Waterfowl, turtles, small mammals, and other animals broadened the diet. Some foods were dried or smoked for storage, while maize and seeds were kept in pits or containers protected as well as possible from moisture, rodents, and insects. Maize itself demanded considerable labour after harvest. Kernels had to be removed from cobs, dried, pounded, ground, soaked, or boiled. Large ceramic vessels allowed cooks to prepare stews containing grain, meat, vegetables, and seeds. One important but easily overlooked practice involved treating maize with an alkaline substance, often made from wood ash or lime. This process improved flavour and made certain nutrients easier for the body to absorb. The precise extent of its use at Cahokia remains debated, but without such preparation, heavy dependence on maize could contribute to nutritional deficiencies. Food knowledge was therefore not simply culinary tradition, it was part of the city's ability to sustain a large population. The central plaza may have hosted meals on a scale far beyond the household. Archaeologists have found large cooking vessels, animal remains, and other traces suggesting communal feasting in Mississippian societies. At Cahokia, major ceremonies could have required enormous quantities of food collected from nearby communities and prepared by teams of workers. Feasts created political theatre. Leaders displayed their ability to provide abundance. Guests renewed alliances, and participants consumed foods with ritual as well as nutritional meaning. The remains of such gatherings entered pits and refuse deposits, leaving fragments of events whose songs, movements, and purposes are gone. Beyond food production, the city contained skilled craftspeople. Potters shaped vessels for cooking, serving, storage, and ceremony. Some pottery was plain and practical, while other pieces carried painted, engraved, or modelled designs. Stoneworkers produced arrow points, knives, scrapers, axes, and specialized tools. Marine shell from the Gulf Coast was transformed into beads, cups, ornaments, and ceremonial objects. Copper arrived through long-distance networks and could be hammered into thin plates or decorative forms. Woodworkers created buildings, bowls, handles, masks, and objects that rarely survive in the damp soil. Craft production may have been concentrated in particular households or districts. Some families perhaps inherited specialized knowledge, while others worked under the direction of elites who controlled rare materials. The evidence remains incomplete. and Cahokia left no marketplace records explaining how objects changed hands. Exchange may have occurred through gifts, obligations, redistribution, barter, ceremonial payment, or household trade. Different systems probably operated at the same time. The Grand Plaza itself may sometimes have functioned as a place of exchange, especially when visitors arrived for ceremonies. Farmers from surrounding settlements could bring food, hides, timber, pottery, and raw materials. Travellers might display unfamiliar ornaments or carry news from distant communities. The plaza could shift from an open ceremonial field into a crowded human landscape of temporary shelters, cooking fires, processions, games, and negotiations. At other moments it may have been kept deliberately clear, reinforcing the authority of those who controlled its use. Crowding created difficulties that monumental architecture could not hide. Cahokia had no underground sewer system, organised garbage collection, or piped water. Residents drew water from natural sources and disposed of refuse in pits, abandoned storage features, or designated dumping areas. Food waste attracted insects, dogs, and scavenging animals. Human waste accumulated near inhabited zones unless carefully managed. During warm, wet periods, standing water encouraged mosquitoes and contamination. Fires could spread rapidly through closely spaced wooden houses, especially when roofs were dry. Disease would have moved differently through Cahokia than through smaller villages. Dense population increased contact between households, while travellers introduced pathogens from outside the region. Smoke from indoor hearths could damage lungs. Repetitive agricultural labour strained joints and backs. Dental problems became more common as maize consumption increased, because starches encouraged decay. Human remains reveal evidence of infection, injury, nutritional stress, and physical labour. Though conditions varied according to age, origin, and social position, the city offered opportunity and ceremonial importance, but urban life did not guarantee health. Children grew up amid these rhythms, learning household work, farming, fishing, toolmaking, and ritual behaviour through observation and participation. They carried water, gathered fuel, frightened birds from crops, cared for younger relatives, and helped process food. Many would not survive to adulthood, a reality common throughout the ancient world. Those who did inherited a city that must have seemed permanent, even though it had been created only a few generations earlier. Social differences shaped daily experience. Families living near important mounds may have possessed greater access to valued foods, materials, and political connections. Others occupied less desirable ground vulnerable to dampness or flooding. Some migrants may have found protection and opportunity, while others remained outsiders. Captives or subordinate groups may have performed the hardest labour. Scholars still debate how sharply Cahokia was divided into social classes, but unequal burials, restricted spaces, and differences in diet suggest that not everyone shared the city's wealth in the same way. Even so, Cahokia could not have functioned through command alone. Neighbourhood cooperation was essential. Roofs had to be repaired, fields tended, fires watched, sick relatives cared for, and ceremonies prepared. People formed friendships, marriages, rivalries, and obligations that crossed the planned geometry of the city. Children played near houses, hunters returned with meat, potters waited for vessels to cool, families mourned the dead and prepared for seasonal changes. These ordinary acts rarely leave dramatic monuments, yet they were the true machinery of the metropolis. From the summit of Monk's Mound, Cahokia appeared unified beneath its sacred centre. From the doorway of an ordinary house, it was a far more intimate and complicated place, crowded, productive, unhealthy, diverse, and alive with competing loyalties. That diversity would become increasingly important, because many of the people cooking beside its hearths had not been born in the city at all. Cahokia's strength depended on attracting outsiders, and its future would depend on whether those newcomers could be woven into a shared identity. The crowded houses surrounding Cahokia's monuments did not all belong to families whose ancestors had lived in the American bottom for generations. Many residents came from elsewhere. Their movements are not recorded in travel accounts or family histories, but traces of their childhood landscapes remain locked inside their teeth. As tooth enamel forms, it absorbs chemical signatures from local water and soil, because enamel does not substantially remodel later in life. Those signatures can be compared with the geology of the place where a person was buried. Studies of Cahokian remains suggest that a significant proportion of the population grew up beyond the immediate region. The exact percentage varies according to the burial sample and method used, but the overall pattern is difficult to dismiss. Cahokia was not merely a local village that became unusually large, it was a city of immigrants. Some newcomers probably travelled only a modest distance, following the river from neighbouring communities. Others may have arrived from hundreds of kilometres away. The Mississippi and its tributaries created natural corridors through the continent, making long-distance movement possible by canoe and overland trails. A journey still required planning, food, shelter, and knowledge of friendly stopping places. But waterways allowed families to transport possessions far more efficiently than they could across land. People approaching Cahokia from the river would have seen its great mound rise above the plain long before they entered its busiest districts. For someone raised in a small farming settlement, the first sight of the city must have been overwhelming. Their reasons for coming were probably as varied as the migrants themselves. Cahokia may have promised fertile land, reliable food, marriage opportunities, protection, trade, or proximity to ceremonies believed to influence harvests and human well-being. Craftspeople could find demand for specialized skills. Ambitious families might seek alliances with powerful leaders. Young adults may have traveled to join relatives already established in the city. Periodic gatherings could have drawn visitors who then chose to remain. Others may have been displaced by local conflict, environmental difficulties, or political pressure in their homelands. Some people may not have chosen migration at all. Captives taken in warfare could have been brought to Cahokia and absorbed into households as servants, labourers, spouses, or sacrificial victims. The archaeological record rarely identifies these experiences clearly. A chemical signature can indicate that someone grew up elsewhere, but it cannot reveal whether that person arrived as an honoured guest, an eager pilgrim, a refugee, or a captive. Grave goods provide clues to status, though burial treatment may reflect the circumstances of death rather than an entire lifetime. Skeletal injuries can suggest violence or heavy labour, yet they cannot explain every social relationship. Scholars still debate how migrants were incorporated and whether particular neighbourhoods were associated with people from specific regions. The layout of Cahokia offers tantalising hints. Some residential districts show differences in pottery styles, food practices, and house construction. These patterns may represent communities preserving traditions brought from their places of origin. A group of migrants might settle near relatives or companions who spoke the same language and followed familiar customs. Within such a neighbourhood, newcomers could prepare food in recognisable ways, teach children inherited skills, and maintain social ties that made life in an unfamiliar metropolis less isolating. Cahokia may therefore have contained many overlapping communities rather than a single uniform culture. At the same time, the city exerted pressure toward a shared identity. Its plazas, mounds, ceremonies, and monumental building projects required people from different backgrounds to participate in common activities. Carrying soil for a mound, attending a feast, watching a ritual, or contributing maize to a public gathering could create a sense of belonging to something larger than one village or kin group. Leaders may have encouraged this process deliberately, presenting Cahokia as a sacred centre capable of uniting diverse peoples beneath a new political and cosmic order. Public ceremonies would have been especially useful for binding strangers together. Repeated performances could teach newcomers where to stand, which symbols mattered, when to gather, and who possessed authority. Feasts transformed agricultural surplus into shared experience. Games and contests allowed communities to compete without necessarily becoming enemies. Marriages connected families from different districts. Monumental construction converted separate bodies into a visible collective force. The city's identity was not simply inherited, it had to be created again and again. This diversity also brought practical advantages. Migrants carried knowledge. A newcomer might understand unfamiliar crops, hunting grounds, medicines, pottery techniques, songs, or exchange routes. People arriving from distant river valleys could connect Cahokia with their former communities, expanding the city's access to materials and information. Different groups may have brought ritual traditions that were combined into new ceremonies. The rapid creativity visible in Cahokian art and architecture may partly reflect this concentration of people who did not all share the same background. Yet diversity could also produce tension. New residents competed for land, food, marriage partners, and access to influential households. Local families may have resented outsiders who received favoured positions. Migrants could remain socially distinct even after years in the city. Differences in speech, clothing, bodily decoration, cooking, or burial customs might mark a person as foreign. In a society without modern police or courts, disputes were managed through kin groups. Neighbourhood leaders, ritual authorities, and political alliances. When those systems worked, difference strengthened the metropolis. When they failed, the same diversity could deepen division. Women may have played a particularly important role in migration and integration. In many ancient societies, marriage moved women between communities, linking distant families and political groups. Isotopic evidence at Cahokia suggests that both men and women came from outside the region, but individual patterns remain difficult to interpret. A migrant woman might enter a local household while maintaining ritual or family ties to her birthplace. Children born in Cahokia could inherit multiple identities, learning the traditions of parents from different regions while growing up beneath the authority of the city's ceremonial centre. The presence of so many newcomers complicates the idea of Cahokia as the capital of a single people. It may have been closer to a coalition city, a sacred metropolis held together by shared institutions rather than common ancestry. Its population may have spoken more than one language. No surviving evidence identifies a single ethnic name used by every resident. The city's unity was therefore political, ceremonial, and economic as much as cultural. That unity could be powerful, but it required continuous effort. One surprising implication is that Cahokia's population may not have sustained itself naturally. Like many pre-modern cities, it probably experienced high mortality from disease, crowding, poor sanitation, and nutritional stress. If deaths regularly exceeded births, continuing migration would have been necessary to maintain its size. The city's apparent demographic strength may therefore have depended on a constant arrival of newcomers. Its leaders needed Cahokia to remain attractive, sacred, prosperous, or powerful enough that people continued to come. For several generations, that attraction endured. Travellers entered through the surrounding settlements, crossed cultivated fields, and approached a skyline of timber buildings and earthen monuments. They brought memories of distant places, but they also entered a landscape designed to reshape identity. Cahokia offered them participation in something unprecedented, a city that gathered the human variety of the Mississippi Valley into one immense centre. Its diversity helped generate its power, connecting neighbourhoods to regions far beyond the floodplain. Those connections would soon become visible in the objects moving toward Cahokia from across the continent, carrying shell from southern coasts, copper from northern lands, stone from distant quarries, and ideas that travelled even farther than the materials themselves. The objects arriving at Cahokia reveal a city connected to a world far larger than the floodplain. Marine shell travelled north from the Gulf Coast. Copper came from regions around the Great Lakes. Fine stone moved from distant quarries. Pigments, minerals, animal products, and carefully crafted objects crossed hundreds of miles through networks that had existed long before Cahokia rose. The city did not invent continental exchange, but it redirected and intensified it. Materials once passed between many local centres now flowed toward a metropolis whose ceremonies, workshops, and leaders could transform them into visible signs of power. These journeys did not depend on wheeled wagons, paved roads, or pack animals. Rivers carried much of the traffic. Canoes moved along the Mississippi and into its tributaries, following an immense watery system that reached toward the Great Lakes, the Appalachian interior, the Great Plains, and the Gulf of Mexico. Overland paths connected the gaps between navigable routes. A traveller might move downstream with the current, cross a portage, stay with allied communities, and continue along another river. Such journeys demanded knowledge of seasonal water levels, dangerous currents, political boundaries, and places where food could be found or exchanged. Most goods probably did not travel from their source to Cahokia in a single uninterrupted voyage. A shell gathered near the Gulf might pass through several communities before reaching the American bottom. At each stage, its meaning and value could change. It might begin as a natural object, become a traded raw material, and finally be cut into beads or ceremonial ornaments by Cahokian craftspeople. The path is difficult to reconstruct because the people who carried it left no commercial logs. What survives in the record shows connection, but rarely reveals whether an object moved through barter, diplomatic gifts, marriage exchanges, tribute, pilgrimage, or the movements of migrants. Marine shell was among the most striking imported materials. Large whelk shells from the southeastern coast could be turned into cups, pendants, beads, and engraved objects. Their pale surfaces stood out against skin, textiles, and dark soil, making them ideal for ceremonial display. Shell also carried associations with water, distant places, and perhaps renewal or the world beneath the human landscape. At Cahokia, enormous quantities of small shell beads required painstaking work. Shell had to be cut, shaped, drilled, polished, and arranged, sometimes into elaborate garments or burial displays. The value of such objects lay not only in their material but in the labour and distance embodied within them. Copper conveyed a different kind of brilliance. It was not smelted in furnaces as iron would be in later industries. Native copper could be cold-hammered, annealed through heating, and shaped into thin sheets, ornaments, or ceremonial forms. Much of it likely originated in the Great Lakes region, far to the north. A polished copper surface reflected firelight and sunlight in a way few local materials could match. Worn on the body or displayed during ritual, it could make a person appear transformed. Access to copper therefore helped mark status, though scholars still debate who controlled its circulation and whether specialized craftspeople worked directly for elite households. Stone traveled in several forms. High-quality chert could be shaped into blades, points, and agricultural tools. Some varieties came from identifiable geological sources, allowing archaeologists to trace movement across regions. Cahokia was particularly associated with large hoe blades made from stone obtained south of the city. These tools were practical instruments for clearing and cultivating fields, but their production and distribution may also have been politically organized. Control over agricultural tools could strengthen control over food, especially in a society increasingly dependent on maize. Other stone objects were less practical. Carefully carved figurines, pipes, tablets, and ceremonial pieces carried images of humans, animals, plants, and supernatural beings. Their styles linked Cahokia to a wider symbolic world often called the Mississippian cultural tradition. Similar themes appeared across distant communities, yet they were not copied mechanically. Local artists altered them, combined them, and gave them new meanings. A bird, serpent, hand, eye, or human figure might carry different associations depending on context. The shared imagery suggests communication across great distances, but not a single uniform religion imposed upon the continent. Cahokia also exported influence. Pottery styles associated with the city have been found beyond the American bottom. Certain settlement forms, mound arrangements, ceremonial practices, and symbolic objects appeared in places connected to Cahokia during or after its rise. Some communities may have adopted Cahokian customs voluntarily because the city possessed prestige. Others may have received migrants, ritual specialists, marriage partners, or political representatives. A few distant settlements show evidence of unusually strong Cahokian connections, raising the possibility that people from the metropolis established colonies or outposts. The evidence remains incomplete, and archaeologists continue to debate whether these places represent direct Cahokian control, imitation, alliance, or local experimentation. One especially important connection extended northward into the upper Mississippi Valley and parts of what are now Wisconsin and Minnesota. At sites far from Cahokia, researchers have found pottery, architecture, and ritual features that resemble those of the metropolis. The sudden appearance of these elements suggests that actual people may have moved north rather than ideas travelling alone. Some migrants may have sought new farmland, trade opportunities, or access to resources. Others may have carried Cahokia's ceremonial authority into regions where local communities responded with curiosity, cooperation, resistance, or a mixture of all three. Trade was therefore inseparable from politics. A rare object given by a Cahokian leader could create obligation. A feast supplied with distant goods demonstrated access to powerful networks. Marriage between influential families could secure a route more effectively than armed force. Visitors arriving with copper, shell, or stone might be welcomed into ceremonies that reinforced the city's central position. Cahokia's wealth was not measured in coin, but in relationships, labour, food, sacred knowledge, and the ability to draw valued things from far away. These exchanges also moved information. Travellers brought news of harvests, conflicts, deaths, alliances, floods, and unusual events in the sky. They carried songs, stories, technologies, and warnings. A city connected to many regions could learn quickly, but it could also become entangled in distant instability. If one route was disrupted by conflict or environmental change, valued materials might disappear. If allied communities rejected Cahokia's authority, the city's prestige could weaken beyond its immediate borders. The presence of exotic goods can make Cahokia appear immensely wealthy, yet most residents probably owned few of them. Ordinary households relied primarily on local clay, wood, bone, fibre, food, and stone. Imported objects were often concentrated in ceremonial deposits, elite spaces, or significant burials. Their scarcity was part of their power. A copper ornament mattered because it was uncommon. A shell cup evoked a coast most people would never see. Distant materials allowed leaders to make the wider world visible inside the city. By gathering these objects, Cahokia presented itself as more than a large settlement. It became a place where the directions of the continent seemed to meet northern copper, southern shell, western stone, riverborne foods, foreign people, and shared symbols assembled around its mounds. Yet material exchange alone could not explain why people accepted Cahokia as a sacred centre. The goods acquired their fullest force within ceremonies that tied the movement of rivers, seasons, crops, ancestors, and celestial bodies into a single ordered landscape. The city's networks reached across the continent, but its leaders claimed to connect something greater still, the human world, to the structure of the cosmos itself. The same city that gathered shell from southern coasts and copper from northern lands also gathered time itself into a visible order. Cahokia's people lived by the movements of the sun, the return of seasons, the flooding of rivers, the migration of animals, and the narrow windows in which maize could be planted and harvested. In a farming society, time was never abstract. Plant too early and young shoots might be damaged by cold. Plant too late and the crop could fail before autumn. Misjudge the rhythm of rain or river water, and stored food might not last through winter. The city's ceremonies, architecture, and political authority were therefore tied to a practical truth. Survival depended on recognizing patterns larger than any individual life. West of Monk's Mound, Cahokians constructed enormous circles of upright wooden posts. Archaeologists commonly call the best-known examples Woodhenge, a modern name borrowed from comparisons with Stonehenge, though the structures were made in a very different cultural world. The posts have long since decayed, leaving only dark circular stains in the soil where timber once stood. By tracing those stains, researchers have reconstructed several rings built at different times. Some contain dozens of posts arranged around a central observation point. At sunrise on particular days, the position of the sun aligned with selected posts on the eastern horizon. The most famous alignment marks the equinox, when the rising sun appears near Monk's Mound as viewed from the circle. Other posts may have indicated the approximate positions of sunrise around the summer and winter solstices. The system was not a clock in the modern sense, and it probably did not allow precise prediction down to a single day without repeated observation. Instead, it provided a monumental framework for watching the annual solar cycle. As the sunrise moved north and south along the horizon, the posts created fixed reference points. Knowledge that might otherwise have remained in the memory of specialists was embedded in the city's architecture. Yet Woodhenge was almost certainly more than an agricultural calendar. Its circular form created a gathering place. The central post or observation point may have been occupied by ritual specialists or leaders, while participants assembled around the ring before dawn. The moment of sunrise could have been accompanied by songs, offerings, processions, or public declarations. No account survives to describe these events, and scholars still debate how each circle was used. But the scale of the post suggests that observation was ceremonial as well as practical. A sunrise that happens every year becomes politically powerful when leaders determine where people gather to witness it and explain what it means. The posts themselves required substantial labour. Large, straight trees had to be selected, cut with stone tools, stripped of branches, transported across the floodplain, and raised into deep pits. Some timbers may have stood several meters high. Replacing them when they decayed required another organized effort. Cahokians built more than one circle, and later versions appear to have differed in size. This repeated rebuilding suggests that the structure was not merely a temporary experiment. It remained significant enough to renew as generations changed and as the ceremonial landscape evolved. Reconstruction may also have been part of the ritual. In Cahokia, important buildings, mounds, and timber monuments were rarely treated as permanent finished objects. They were enlarged, burned, covered, replaced, or rebuilt. A structure's destruction did not necessarily signal neglect. It could mark completion, purification, succession, or renewal. Old posts might be removed and new ones raised in a slightly altered pattern, preserving continuity while allowing leaders to claim that cosmic order had been restored. The city itself was continually remade, as if stability could only be maintained through controlled transformation. Cahokia's planners also paid attention to direction. Monk's Mound, plazas, mounds, causeways, and timber circles were arranged in ways that emphasized broad north-south and east-west relationships. Although not every feature follows a perfect geometric grid, some deviations reflect uneven terrain, older settlement remains, construction changes, or priorities that archaeologists do not yet understand. The evidence remains incomplete, but the repeated attention to orientation suggests that cardinal directions carried meaning. The rising and setting sun divided the horizon. Rivers and bluffs framed movement. Elevated mounds linked earth to sky, while pits, burials, and water features reached symbolically downward. Across later indigenous traditions of eastern North America, the universe is often understood as a layered and directional place populated by human beings, ancestors, animals, and powerful forces associated with the sky, land, and water. These traditions cannot simply be projected unchanged back onto Cahokia, because beliefs develop over time and differ among nations. Even so, the imagery and architecture of the Mississippian world suggest related concerns. Birds, especially powerful raptors, could be associated with the upper world. Serpents and underwater beings could belong to forces beneath or beyond the ordinary surface. Humans lived between them, responsible for maintaining balance through correct relationships and ceremonial action. Cahokia may have presented itself as the center where those relationships were renewed. Monk's Mound rose like an artificial mountain. The Grand Plaza created a broad horizontal plain. Timber circles followed the sun. Nearby waters surrounded the city with channels, lakes, marshes, and seasonal floods. Processional routes connected significant locations. Seen together, these elements formed more than a collection of impressive constructions. They created a model of an ordered universe in which the city occupied the middle ground between sky, earth, and water. Seasonal ceremonies may have followed the agricultural year. Spring brought planting and the return of certain animals. Summer required weeding, fishing, gathering, and careful attention to rain. Late summer and autumn brought green corn, mature harvests, communal labor, and storage. Winter opened a different ceremonial season, when preserved food supported gatherings and stories while the fields rested. Leaders who coordinated these events could present abundance as evidence that the proper relationships had been maintained. A successful harvest reinforced the authority of the ceremonial system. A failed harvest threatened it. Games may also have been woven into public gatherings. One widespread Mississippian activity, often known from later accounts as chunky, involved rolling a polished stone disc across the ground while players cast long spears toward the point where they expected it to stop. Cahokia has produced numerous chunky stones, including finely made examples that may have carried ceremonial or social value. Matches could draw spectators, encourage wagering, and channel rivalry between individuals or groups. On the Grand Plaza, such contests may have combined sport, diplomacy, ritual, and political theatre. Large gatherings required food, hospitality, and careful organization. Visitors had to be housed or camped around the city. Huge meals had to be prepared. Public spaces had to be cleared, monuments repaired, and ritual objects assembled. These occasions allowed Cahokia's leaders to display control over both people and time. They did not merely command labor, they announced when the population should gather, when ceremonies began, and how seasonal change should be interpreted. This authority was powerful but fragile. Leaders could not make the sun rise or guarantee rain. Their position depended on persuading the population that ceremony helped maintain the world's balance. When crops flourished and gatherings filled the plaza, the city's order appeared confirmed. When floods, drought, illness, or conflict disrupted life, people could begin to doubt those who claimed privileged access to sacred knowledge. For generations, however, Cahokia's ceremonial landscape seems to have held that trust. At dawn, observers watched the sun emerge between distant posts and monumental earthworks. Crowds gathered in spaces aligned with forces older than the city itself. The metropolis became not only the center of a trade network or a seat of political power, but a place where the movements of the heavens appeared to touch the human world. Yet the same sacred order that united Cahokia also created sharp distinctions between those who interpreted it, those who served it, and those whose bodies were used to sustain it. Beneath some of the city's mounds, archaeology would uncover the most unsettling evidence of those divisions. South of Cahokia's central precinct, beneath what appears today as another low rise in the grass, archaeologists uncovered one of the most disturbing and complicated burial places in ancient North America. The mound is known as Mound 72, a modern label that gives no hint of what lay beneath it. Excavation revealed a sequence of graves, mass burials, ceremonial deposits, and carefully arranged bodies placed there over time. The discoveries seemed at first to offer a direct view into Cahokia's ruling elite. Instead, they opened a deeper argument about power, sacrifice, gender, and the danger of allowing a dramatic first interpretation to harden into historical fact. Mound 72 was not a simple grave covered in a single act. It developed through several episodes of burial and construction, probably during the period when Cahokia was expanding most rapidly. Its location was significant. The mound stood near a formal north-south axis extending from the central city, and its position may have connected it to processions, celestial relationships, or a boundary between the living population and a ceremonial landscape of death. Earlier timber posts or markers appear to have occupied the area before the mound reached its final form, suggesting that the place already carried importance before the burials began. The most famous discovery was a central burial once described as the grave of a powerful man laid upon a platform of shell beads. Tens of thousands of small beads had been arranged so that they appeared to form the image of a bird, with a head, wings, and tail extending beneath the body. Because bird imagery, especially that of falcons or other raptors, appears in later Mississippian symbolism connected with warfare, celestial power, and elite identity. The burial quickly became known as the Beaded Birdman. In popular reconstructions, a single male ruler rested at the center of Cahokia's political and religious world, surrounded by sacrificed attendants and symbols of supernatural authority. It was a compelling image, perhaps too compelling. Later reanalysis of the excavation records and skeletal remains showed that the central deposit had been misunderstood. The burial did not contain only one powerful man. At least two individuals lay upon or near the shell bead arrangement, and one of them was female. Additional remains once interpreted as male were also reconsidered. The famous bird shape itself may have been reconstructed too confidently from bead concentrations disturbed by decomposition, soil pressure, and excavation. What had been presented as the clear grave of a male warrior priest became something far more ambiguous. This revision matters because archaeological interpretation is shaped by expectation. Early researchers were familiar with models of societies ruled by powerful men, and dramatic objects associated with birds and warfare seemed to confirm those assumptions. A central woman did not fit the original story as neatly, so her presence was overlooked or misidentified. The corrected interpretation does not prove that Cahokia was governed by women, nor does it erase the possibility of male authority. It demonstrates something more basic: the evidence remains incomplete, and even carefully excavated graves can be forced into familiar narratives that their builders never intended. The shell beads may carry meanings beyond individual status. Their arrangement has been connected to fertility, renewal, celestial imagery, and the paired or complementary forces through which Cahokians may have understood the universe. Male and female individuals buried together could represent marriage, ancestry, political alliance, sacred balance, or roles that do not correspond to modern categories. The mound may have commemorated a founding event or ceremonial lineage rather than a single ruler. No surviving explanation tells us which reading is correct. Other graves within Mound 72 were more violent. In one deposit, the bodies of dozens of young women were placed together. Many appear to have been of similar age, and chemical studies suggest that at least some grew up outside the Cahokia region. Their placement has often been interpreted as evidence of human sacrifice, perhaps during the burial of important individuals or the dedication of the mound. They were laid in ordered groups rather than thrown randomly into a pit, indicating deliberate ceremonial treatment even if their deaths were forced. Another burial contained men and women whose bodies showed evidence of violence. Some had been decapitated, others were placed in disordered positions, unlike the carefully arranged central graves. Nearby deposits included bundles of bones, isolated remains, and individuals buried face down. These differences suggest that Mound 72 gathered people of sharply unequal status. Some were honoured, ornamented, and positioned with care. Others may have been captives, servants, political enemies, or selected victims whose deaths contributed to the power of the ceremony. The exact scale and nature of sacrifice at Cahokia remain debated. Human sacrifice is known from several complex societies, where death could be used to accompany leaders, renew sacred places, display political dominance, or communicate with supernatural forces. At Mound 72, the combination of mass graves, unusual body positions, demographic patterns, and violent injuries makes some form of ritual killing difficult to dismiss. Yet not every person in the mound was necessarily killed for burial. Some remains may have been moved from earlier graves. Others may have died naturally and been reburied during later ceremonies. No single explanation accounts for every deposit. The young women present an especially troubling mystery. If they were migrants, they may have come willingly to Cahokia before their deaths. Perhaps as members of households or ceremonial communities, they may instead have been captives brought from elsewhere. Their similar ages could reflect deliberate selection, but it might also result from a particular social group being buried together. Earlier claims that they were all physically identical or represented a single foreign population have weakened under closer analysis. Their lives cannot be reconstructed from the manner of their deaths alone. What survives in the record suggests that death at Cahokia was not treated as a private household matter when powerful people were involved. Elite burial could become a public act requiring labour, rare materials, carefully selected locations, and the bodies of others. The construction of the mound transformed grief, succession, and violence into architecture. Once covered with earth, the dead became part of the ceremonial landscape. People walking past the mound may have remembered who lay beneath it, what event the burial commemorated, and which families or leaders claimed connection to those remains. Mound 72 also reveals how Cahokia's distant networks entered its burial practices. Marine shell formed beads in enormous quantities. Stone points and other objects were deposited in carefully prepared groups. Some arrowheads were made from materials obtained far beyond the immediate region, and their arrangement may have represented different communities, directions, or military power. Valuable objects were removed from circulation and placed underground, demonstrating that ceremonial meaning could outweigh practical use. The mound's violence should not be used to portray Cahokia as uniquely brutal. Medieval London, with which the city is often compared, also existed within a world of executions, warfare, severe inequality, and high mortality. Large political centres frequently concentrate both creative achievement and coercive power. Cahokia was capable of gathering diverse peoples, producing extraordinary art, organising continental exchange, and reshaping a landscape on a monumental scale. The graves show that this order could also demand human lives. For those who watched Mound 72 rise, the burials may have confirmed the authority of Cahokia's sacred centre. They demonstrated that leaders controlled rare materials, ritual knowledge, and the fate of human bodies, yet coercion leaves memories as surely as ceremony does. Families and communities may have mourned those taken for burial. Migrants may have understood that the city's promises of belonging carried risks. Political rivals could read the mound as a warning. The central precinct projected a universe held in balance, but beneath its ordered surfaces lay people treated very differently in death. Some became ancestors surrounded by shell and symbolism. Others entered the ground anonymously in groups, their names and origins lost. That inequality was not hidden from Cahokia's population. It was built into the ceremonial landscape itself, and as the city continued to grow, The rulers at its centre would take another dramatic step to separate sacred authority from the wider population. They would surround the heart of Cahokia with a massive wall. At some point during Cahokia's height, the open relationship between the sacred centre and the surrounding city changes. A massive timber wall rises around the central precinct, enclosing Monk's Mound, the Grand Plaza, and several of the city's most important ceremonial spaces. The barrier stretches for nearly 3 kilometres and is reinforced by projecting bastions placed at regular intervals. It is not a decorative fence. It is a formidable structure built from thousands of upright logs, each cut, transported, shaped, and planted deeply into the ground, for a city whose identity had been expressed through gathering, movement, and shared monumental labour. The decision to build such a boundary marked a profound shift. The palisade did not appear only once. Archaeological evidence suggests that it was rebuilt several times, sometimes along slightly different lines. Timber rotted quickly in the wet floodplain, so replacement was necessary. But the scale of repeated reconstruction indicates continuing commitment. Each rebuilding demanded another enormous harvest of trees and another round of coordinated labour. Forests near the city were already being consumed for houses, fuel, public buildings, and mound construction. Raising the wall again meant sending workers farther outward to find suitable straight trunks, then hauling those heavy timbers back across the plain. The practical appearance of the palisade is difficult to ignore. Closely spaced posts formed a solid wooden screen high enough to restrict sight and movement. Bastions projected outward, giving defenders positions from which they could observe or attack anyone approaching the wall. Gates controlled entry into the ceremonial centre. A resident who had once crossed freely between neighbourhoods and plazas may now have encountered guarded passageways, narrow approaches, and a clear distinction between those permitted inside and those kept beyond the barrier. The simplest explanation is warfare. A fortified wall suggests that Cahokia's rulers feared attack, perhaps from neighbouring communities, political rivals, or groups resisting the city's growing demands. The Mississippi Valley was not free from conflict before Cahokia, and competition over farmland, hunting territory, trade routes, captives, and political influence could produce violence. A metropolis that concentrated wealth, stored food, rare materials, and powerful leaders would have presented an attractive target. The palisade may therefore record a period when Cahokia's dominance was being challenged. Yet there is surprisingly little direct evidence for a single invading army, or a catastrophic assault on the central precinct. No obvious destruction layer proves that enemies stormed the wall. Weapons and violent injuries occur in the archaeological record, but they do not reveal a clear siege. Scholars still debate whether the palisade was built in response to an immediate military threat, or whether its defensive appearance served a broader political purpose. A wall can protect against attack even when no attack occurs, but it can also shape fear, authority, and identity without ever being tested in battle. The barrier may have separated elites from the expanding population. Cahokia had become a diverse city filled with migrants, local families, labourers, visitors, and people of uncertain status, as its leaders claimed increasing sacred and political authority. They may have sought to control access to ceremonies, stores, residences, and ritual objects. The wall transformed the central zone into an exclusive enclosure. Monk's Mound still dominated the skyline, but its summit and surrounding precinct were no longer physically continuous with ordinary neighbourhoods. This separation may have altered how power was experienced. Earlier, monumental construction had brought people together in shared work and public gathering. The plaza could still hold great crowds, but entry into the enclosed centre was now regulated. Those within the wall appeared protected, elevated, and distinct. Those outside faced a visible reminder that the sacred heart of the city did not belong equally to everyone. The architecture of unity had acquired an architecture of exclusion. The palisade may also have carried symbolic meaning. Boundaries in ceremonial landscapes can separate sacred ground from ordinary space, the living from the dead, insiders from outsiders, or order from dangerous forces beyond. The wall could therefore have served both ritual and defensive functions. Its builders may not have recognized the modern distinction between a military fortification and a sacred boundary, protecting the center from enemies, disorder, pollution, or supernatural danger may have belonged to the same understanding of how the world should be arranged. Even if symbolic, however, the bastions remain difficult to explain away. Their regular spacing resembles features designed for defense, allowing people to watch the base of the wall and cover areas that could not be seen from behind a straight barrier. Their presence suggests that practical violence was at least imaginable. Cahokia's leaders may have used ritual meaning to justify a fortification that also protected them from human threats. No single explanation fully accounts for the structure because its functions probably changed over time. The wall also redirected movement through the city. Paths that once approached the plaza directly may have been blocked. Gates created points where visitors could be observed, delayed, welcomed, searched, or denied entry. Goods passing into the center could be counted or controlled. Ceremonial processions became more dramatic as participants moved through narrow openings before entering a vast open space. The contrast between confinement at the gate and exposure in the plaza may have intensified the emotional power of public events. For the people who built it, the palisade was another demonstration of organized labor. Thousands of logs standing shoulder to shoulder made the city's authority visible in a new form. Monk's Mound showed the power to raise earth. The wall showed the power to close space. Its very existence announced that the center contained something worth protecting, and that those who controlled it possessed the right to determine who could approach. But repeated rebuilding carried a cost. Timber extraction accelerated environmental pressure. Workers assigned to the wall were not tending fields, hunting, repairing homes, or producing tools. Food had to support them. Leaders had to maintain the loyalty or obedience necessary to mobilize labor for a project whose benefits may have seemed clearer to elites than to ordinary households. A farmer living beyond the enclosure might have wondered whether the wall protected the whole city or only those at its center. The timing of the palisade's construction is not precise enough to connect it confidently with one crisis. It may have begun while Cahokia was still powerful and crowded, perhaps as a sign of growing centralization rather than decline. Yet walls often reveal anxiety even when they are built during prosperity. A society secure in its relationships does not usually invest repeatedly in barriers of this scale. The palisade suggests that Cahokia's leaders perceived dangers military, political, social or sacred that the earlier open landscape could no longer contain. Those dangers may have come partly from within. A diverse migrant population required continuous integration. Inequality had become visible in housing, burial, food access, and ceremonial privilege. The deaths beneath Mound 72 showed that power could be coercive. Communities outside the central precinct may have resisted demands for labor or tribute. Rival leaders could have challenged those on Monk's Mound. The wall may have protected the sacred center not only from distant enemies, but from the very population whose work had created it. Beyond the palisade, the metropolis continued to function. Hearths burned, fields were planted, traders arrived, and ceremonies drew crowds. Yet the relationship between center and city had changed. Cahokia's most powerful institutions now stood behind timber. The wall offered security, but it also admitted that unity could no longer be assumed. As the palisade was rebuilt, other signs of strain accumulated more quietly. Forests receded. Agricultural demands intensified. Water and sanitation problems grew more serious. The population's health reflected crowding and hard labor. Rivers and weather continued to behave according to forces no ruler could command. Cahokia still appeared immense, but beneath its monuments and walls, the systems supporting the metropolis were becoming harder to sustain. The first signs of Cahokia's weakness do not appear as a single dramatic catastrophe. There is no one layer of ash marking the end, no collapsed gate beneath which an army leaves its weapons, and no surviving record announcing that the city has entered a crisis. Instead, strain accumulates through ordinary systems that become harder to maintain. Houses must be repaired more often. Timber must be carried from farther away. Fields must feed a population concentrated in one place. Water must remain clean despite dense settlement. Leaders must continue to organize labor, ceremonies, food, and loyalty. Each problem is manageable on its own. Together, they begin to narrow the margin between stability and failure. Wood was among the city's most constant needs. Every house required posts, roof supports, wall material, and fuel. Public buildings consumed larger timbers. Palisades demanded thousands of straight logs and had to be rebuilt as the wood decayed. Ceremonial circles, workshops, cooking fires, and mound construction added to the pressure. The nearest forests could not supply this demand indefinitely. As suitable trees disappeared, workers had to travel farther, increasing the time and energy required for every building project. Deforestation may also have changed the surrounding environment by exposing soil to erosion and reducing the landscape's ability to absorb heavy rainfall. For years, a popular explanation claimed that widespread tree clearance caused severe erosion, filling local waterways with sediment and producing floods that helped destroy Cahokia. Later research has complicated that picture. Some sediment once interpreted as evidence of catastrophic deforestation appears to have accumulated through longer natural processes, and no single environmental mechanism explains the city's decline. Scholars still debate the extent of Cahokia's impact on nearby forests and waters. Even so, the practical burden of obtaining timber would have grown as the city remained large. Environmental stress does not require a single ecological disaster. It can emerge as a steady increase in effort for the same result. Agriculture carried a similar risk. Cahokia depended heavily on maize, supported by squash, native seed crops, hunting, fishing, and gathering. Maize could produce large harvests and store well, making urban concentration possible. Yet an agricultural system organized around a few staple crops became vulnerable to bad weather. Excess rain could rot plants or delay planting. Drought could reduce yields across the floodplain, insects, birds, disease. And soil exhaustion could destroy part of a harvest. A village facing local crop failure might relocate or rely more heavily on wild resources. A city of thousands required far greater reserves. The richest fields also became politically important. Families needed access to elevated ground that was less likely to flood. While leaders may have directed labour or claimed portions of the harvest for ceremonies, construction crews, and elite households, as the population grew, competition over productive land could sharpen. Farmers farther from the city faced longer journeys between fields and homes. Others may have lived in satellite settlements and supplied the centre through obligations that are no longer visible archaeologically. What survives in the record suggests a regional food system, but its exact organisation remains uncertain. Flooding was always part of life in the American bottom. The Mississippi and nearby channels created the fertile landscape that supported Cahokia, but they also threatened homes, fields, and stored food. Recent geological work has identified major flood episodes in the region, including events that may have occurred during Cahokia's later history. A large flood could contaminate water, destroy crops, damage houses, and force communities from low-lying ground. Yet the dates and local effects remain difficult to match precisely with changes in the city. Flooding likely contributed to stress, but it cannot by itself explain why Cahokia declined while people continued living elsewhere in the valley. Drought presented the opposite danger. Climate evidence from the broader region suggests periods of reduced rainfall during the centuries when Cahokia began to weaken. Even a short sequence of dry years could undermine confidence in leaders whose authority was connected to agricultural order and seasonal ceremony. Stored grain might carry the population through one poor harvest, but repeated shortages could expose inequality. Elite households and ritual institutions may have retained access to food while ordinary families suffered. Hunger transforms political tension into personal anger with remarkable speed. The city's density created problems that no amount of ceremonial authority could completely solve. Water sources near residential districts were vulnerable to contamination from waste, animal remains, refuse pits, and runoff. Mosquitoes bred in wetlands and standing water. Smoke filled houses and hovered over neighborhoods. Infectious disease spread more easily among crowded families and through gatherings that brought visitors from distant regions. Archaeological remains show evidence of infection and nutritional stress, though these conditions were not uniform and cannot be tied to one epidemic. Children were especially vulnerable. Periods of poor nutrition leave marks in developing teeth and bones, preserving episodes when growth was interrupted by illness or hunger. Adults carried evidence of hard physical labor, injuries, joint damage, and dental decay associated partly with a maize-rich diet. Cahokia may have depended on continuing immigration, because deaths in the dense urban population exceeded births. If the city became less attractive or distant communities stopped sending newcomers, population decline could accelerate even without a sudden mortality event. The burden of monumental labor may also have grown heavier. Mounds had to be enlarged or repaired. Public buildings were rebuilt. The palisade consumed timber and work. Ceremonies required food and preparation. These projects once may have inspired people by demonstrating shared purpose and sacred power. Over time, the same obligations could feel extractive. A family facing a weak harvest might resist surrendering grain for a feast. A farmer asked to carry earth or cut timber might question why elite buildings required renewal while ordinary houses decayed. Political authority depends not only on force but on successful explanation. Cahokia's leaders may have claimed that ritual, sacrifice, correct timing, and public labour maintained balance between human society and the wider universe. When harvests were good and crowds filled the plaza, that claim appeared credible. When floods damaged fields, drought reduced maize, disease spread, or conflict intensified, people could interpret failure as evidence that leaders had lost sacred power. The very ideology that strengthened Cahokia in prosperity may have made its rulers vulnerable during crisis. Inequality sharpened these doubts. Monumental residences stood above the city. Important burials contained rare objects and elaborate treatment. The central precinct lay behind a wall. Some people enjoyed privileged access to food, ceremony, and distant materials, while others performed difficult labour and lived on wetter, less desirable ground. No ancient city distributed hardship equally. When resources became scarce, social divisions that had once seemed permanent or sacred could become dangerous. Tension may have emerged between migrants and established communities, between central leaders and local authorities, or between neighbourhoods with different origins and obligations. Cahokia's diversity had been one of its greatest strengths, but maintaining unity required constant exchange, marriage, ceremony, and political negotiation. If the centre could no longer provide security or abundance, loyalty might return to kin groups and regional communities. People did not need to attack the city to weaken it. They could simply leave, refuse labour, redirect trade, or stop participating in its ceremonies. By the early 13th century, Cahokia remained inhabited and important, but its peak had passed. Some residential areas thinned, construction slowed or changed. The great central monuments still dominated the plain, yet the population supporting them was becoming smaller and less cohesive. The city had not collapsed in one moment. It was entering a long unravelling, driven by environmental uncertainty, social inequality, political strain, and the growing difficulty of persuading thousands of people that life beneath Cahokia's sacred centre remained worth the cost. Cahokia does not end in a single night. No enemy army sweeps across the Grand Plaza and leaves the metropolis burning behind it. No earthquake buries the houses. No final ruler records a last decree before the population disappears. Instead, the city contracts unevenly across generations. Some neighbourhoods empty before others. Certain monuments remain in use while nearby houses are abandoned. Public construction declines, yet parts of the ceremonial centre continue to matter. The process is slower and more complicated than a dramatic fall, which is precisely why the cause remains difficult to isolate. Cahokia's decline is not one mystery with one hidden solution. It is a knot of environmental pressure, political failure, social division, demographic change, and individual decisions repeated thousands of times. For much of the 20th century, explanations often centered on ecological self-destruction. According to this view, Cahokia's population cleared too many trees, exhausted nearby soils, increased erosion, and damaged the waterways on which the city depended. The story carried a familiar warning: a society grows too large, consumes its environment, and collapses beneath the consequences. Parts of this interpretation remain plausible. A metropolis built almost entirely from timber required enormous quantities of wood. Intensive cultivation and repeated harvests affected soils. People certainly altered the floodplain. Yet later research has shown that the environmental history was not so simple. Some deposits once blamed on Cahokian deforestation may have resulted from natural river processes, and the surrounding landscape retained more complexity than an image of total ecological ruin suggests. Climate provides another piece of the puzzle. Cahokia rose during a period that may have offered relatively favourable growing conditions, then weakened as rainfall became less predictable. Evidence from tree rings, lake sediments, and other regional climate records suggests episodes of drought during the later centuries of the city's occupation. A severe drought does not leave the same archaeological signature as a burned building, but its consequences can spread through every level of society. Maize yields fall, Stored reserves shrink, hunting pressure increases. Communities compete over reliable water and productive fields. Leaders who once promised abundance must explain why ceremonies no longer seem to produce order. Flooding may also have struck at vulnerable moments. The American bottom is fertile because it is shaped by water, and that same water can erase fields and displace settlements. Geological evidence indicates that major floods affected the Mississippi Valley during Cahokia's history. Researchers continue to debate which events reached the urban center, how severe they were, and whether they aligned precisely with population decline. A flood may have damaged one district while sparing another. It may have destroyed crops without leaving houses permanently submerged. Climate stress, therefore, appears less like a single fatal blow and more like repeated shocks, testing a system already under tension. Warfare has long been proposed as another cause. The palisade surrounding the ceremonial core looks defensive, and evidence from the wider region shows that violence increased in some places during the centuries following Cahokia's peak. Communities farther from the city sometimes relocated to more defensible positions. Skeletal remains from certain Mississippian sites carry signs of conflict, execution, and raiding. Cahokia may have faced hostile neighbors, rebellious subject communities, or competition from emerging regional centers, yet there is no convincing evidence that one successful siege destroyed the capital. If warfare contributed, it probably did so through insecurity, disrupted trade, loss of farmland, and the steady weakening of political authority. Internal conflict may have mattered more than invasion. Cahokia was a city of migrants held together by ceremonies, labor obligations, exchange, and the authority of its central institutions. Such a coalition could be powerful while leaders delivered prosperity and maintained alliances under stress. However, old differences could reappear. Neighborhoods with distinct origins may have withdrawn cooperation. Local chiefs may have resisted demands from the center. Families could refuse to provide grain or workers. Rival factions might compete over succession, sacred offices, or access to the summit of Monk's Mound. None of these struggles would necessarily leave an obvious archaeological trace, especially if conflict took the form of political withdrawal rather than open battle. Religious legitimacy may have weakened alongside political control. Cahokia's monumental landscape presented the city as a place where human action aligned with the sun, seasons, water, fertility, and the powers of the cosmos. That claim was a source of strength, but it created expectations. When drought followed ritual, when floods crossed sacred boundaries, or when hunger persisted despite sacrifice, people may have questioned whether the center still possessed the power it claimed. A ruler whose authority depends upon cosmic balance faces a particular danger when the world appears visibly unbalanced. The decline of long-distance networks may have reinforced that doubt. Cahokia's prestige was partly expressed through copper, shell, stone, skilled crafts, and relationships extending far beyond the floodplain. If allied communities broke away, trade routes shifted, or distant populations rejected Cahokian influence, rare materials became harder to obtain. The loss was not merely economic. Exotic objects helped make authority visible. A leader who could no longer gather the wider world into ceremonies at the capital appeared less powerful than those of earlier generations. Population decline may then have become self-reinforcing. Cahokia likely depended on newcomers to maintain its size. Urban mortality, disease, and nutritional stress could reduce the population even during prosperous periods. Once the city's reputation weakened, fewer migrants arrived. Families already living there may have moved outward towards smaller communities where land was more accessible. Disease spread less easily, and local leaders demanded less labor. Empty houses reduced neighborhood cooperation, abandoned fields lowered food production, fewer workers were available to maintain palisades, plazas, mounds, and public buildings. The city became less attractive precisely because it was becoming less populated. There may also have been resistance to the form of power Cahokia represented. Its ruling system had concentrated labor, ceremony, wealth, and perhaps violence at the center. Monumental construction required thousands of workers. Elite burials could involve the deaths of others. Walls separated sacred precincts from ordinary residents. When the benefits of centralization declined, people may not have tried to repair the system. They may have chosen to dismantle it by leaving. The abandonment of Cahokia could therefore represent not only failure, but rejection, a movement away from a social order that had become too demanding, unequal, or dangerous. No single explanation fully accounts for the city's unravelling, because these forces would have interacted. Drought could reduce food, which weakened leaders, which increased conflict, which disrupted trade, which encouraged migration, which made public works impossible to maintain. Flooding could damage fields already under pressure. Political division could prevent a coordinated response to environmental hardship. Disease could spread more quickly among malnourished households. A crisis in one part of the system pushed against every other part. The chronology also warns against simple answers. Cahokia's population began declining before some of the most severe later climatic events identified in the region. Certain surrounding communities persisted after the central city weakened. Monumental activity did not cease everywhere at once. The metropolis appears to have passed through phases of contraction, reorganization, and partial recovery before its final abandonment. This was not a smooth line downward, but a series of attempts to preserve a system that no longer commanded the resources or loyalty it once possessed. By the 13th century, the contrast between Cahokia's monuments and its population must have become striking. Monk's Mound still towered over the floodplain. The Grand Plaza remained broad enough for thousands. The palisade still marked a central precinct. Yet fewer hearths burned in the surrounding neighbourhoods. Buildings disappeared without replacement. Paths grew quieter. Fields reclaimed former residential ground. The architecture of greatness outlasted the society that had made it meaningful. Eventually, sometime before European arrival in the region, the urban centre ceased to function as a metropolis. The people did not vanish into the air, and the civilization did not suffer a mysterious extinction. Households moved, communities reorganized, political traditions changed, knowledge travelled with those who departed. Cahokia's collapse was real, but disappearance is the wrong image. The city emptied because its people continued living elsewhere, carrying fragments of its world into new landscapes while the great mounds remained behind. As Cahokia's houses empty, the people who lived within them do not disappear. They leave by canoe, along riverbanks, across fields, and through the network of paths that once carried visitors toward the city. Families take what they can move: tools, baskets, seed, pottery, clothing, ritual objects, and memories of places that may already feel older than they truly are. Some travel only a short distance to nearby settlements. Others return to regions their parents or grandparents had left generations earlier. A few may join distant communities linked to Cahokia through trade, marriage, or ceremony. The metropolis fades, but its population flows outward into a continent already filled with towns, alliances, rivalries, and histories of its own. This movement was probably gradual enough that no one witnessed a single final departure. One neighbourhood might lose half its households while another remained occupied. A family could abandon a decaying house and establish a farm beyond the crowded centre. Still returning for ceremonies, a local leader might transfer followers to a smaller settlement where authority was easier to maintain. Migrants who had never fully severed ties with their homelands may have retraced familiar routes. As public institutions weakened, departure became increasingly practical. Fewer workers maintained plazas and palisades. Trade diminished. Fields closer to the centre may have become less productive or politically contested. The advantages of remaining declined while the freedom of leaving grew. Archaeologists cannot follow most individual families from one village to another. Timber houses decay. Household objects are common across wide regions, and people did not leave written records describing their migrations. Pottery styles, settlement patterns, food remains, and burial customs provide clues, but cultural practices do not move in simple lines. A vessel made in a Cahokian style might have travelled as an object, been copied by a local potter, or been produced by someone who had grown up near the city. Similar architecture may reflect migration, shared ideas, or independent responses to comparable needs. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single map can show exactly where Cahokia's residents went. What can be rejected is the older claim that they belong to a mysterious vanished race. Cahokia developed within the indigenous histories of North America, and its people remained part of those histories after the city declined. The label Mississippian describes a broad archaeological tradition rather than one nation or unified empire. Across the southeast and central river valleys, Mississippian communities built platform mounds, cultivated maize, organized towns around plazas, created distinctive art, and maintained political systems that varied greatly from place to place. Cahokia was the largest and perhaps the most influential center of its early period, but it was never the only one. As Cahokia weakened, other centers continued or rose elsewhere. Some communities developed powerful chiefdoms with their own mounds, plazas, ceremonial traditions, and regional networks. These societies did not simply inherit a complete Cahokian blueprint. They adapted practices to local landscapes and political conditions. A platform mound might support a council house in one place and an elite residence in another. Shared symbols could carry different meanings. Towns could form around hereditary rulers, councils, clans, ritual leaders, or combinations that changed over time. Cahokia's influence was part of this world, but it did not dictate every form that followed. People leaving the metropolis carried practical knowledge as well as ceremonial ideas. They knew how to plan plazas, construct large buildings, raise earthen platforms, manage maize harvests, organize communal labor, and maintain exchange across river systems. Craftspeople carried techniques for shaping shell, copper, stone, clay, wood, and fiber. Farmers carried seed varieties adapted through generations of cultivation. Ritual specialists carried songs, calendars, origin traditions, and knowledge of how ceremonies were timed. Families carried stories about the enormous mound beside the Mississippi and the rulers who had once stood above the Grand Plaza. Those memories may not have survived unchanged. A collapsed capital can become a warning, a sacred ancestral place, a symbol of lost authority, or a landscape associated with dangerous power. Descendants might remember Cahokia through stories that no outsider later recognized as historical accounts. Names changed as languages shifted, communities merged, divided, migrated, and reorganized. Centuries of warfare, diplomacy, epidemic disease, forced removal, and colonial disruption later fractured oral histories and separated nations from ancestral landscapes. The absence of a simple surviving story naming Cahokia does not mean that all memory was erased. The city's decline may itself have influenced later political choices. Cahokia had concentrated extraordinary power in one center. Its leaders commanded monumental labor, controlled sacred spaces, and presided over visible inequality. When that system unraveled, communities may have become wary of rebuilding authority on the same scale. Smaller, more dispersed settlements could reduce disease, ease pressure on farmland, and make it harder for one elite group to demand enormous labor projects. Moving away from urban life was not necessarily a retreat into simplicity. It may have been a deliberate adaptation based on the remembered costs of concentration. This possibility complicates modern ideas of collapse. Cities are often treated as the highest stage of social development, so their abandonment appears automatically as failure. Yet a population can leave a city while preserving knowledge, identity, and political creativity. A massive capital may cease to serve the people who sustain it. Smaller communities may offer greater resilience, flexibility, and autonomy. Cahokia's residents did not need to forget how to build mounds in order to decide that another monk's mound was unnecessary. Even the abandoned landscape probably remained active for some time. Travelers passed through, hunters crossed former neighborhoods, farmers may have cultivated parts of the old settlement. Ceremonies could have continued at selected mounds after permanent residents declined. Graves and monuments retained meaning even when roofs disappeared. The Grand Plaza slowly grew quieter, but the place did not instantly become unknown wilderness. Its transformation from capital to ancestral landscape likely unfolded over generations. Nature returned unevenly. Wooden buildings collapsed and decayed into the soil. Palisade posts rotted at ground level. Unmaintained plazas filled with vegetation. Trees grew in abandoned residential zones. Rain softened mound edges, while burrowing animals disturbed layers beneath the surface. Floods deposited sediment in low areas. From a distance, human architecture began to resemble natural terrain. The city's disappearance was assisted by the very materials from which it had been built. Yet Monk's Mound endured. Smaller earthworks survived around it, holding burials, building remains, and ceremonial deposits inside their mass. The abandoned monuments became silent containers of social memory. Every basket of earth remained where workers had placed it, even after their names were forgotten. The physical city persisted long after its political system vanished. Farther across the Mississippian world, urban and ceremonial traditions continued for centuries. When Europeans eventually entered the southeast, they encountered large indigenous towns, agricultural fields, mound centers, political confederacies, and leaders capable of mobilizing substantial populations. These societies had their own histories and cannot be reduced to fragments of Cahokia, but their existence exposed the falsehood of an empty continent. They belonged to the same broader world of indigenous innovation in which Cahokia had once flourished. European invasion would bring catastrophe on a scale Cahokia's residents could never have imagined. Diseases spread through communities with no previous exposure. Warfare, enslavement, missionization, displacement, and colonial expansion shattered political systems and transformed landscapes. By the time many European chroniclers attempted to explain the ancient mounds, the descendants of mound-building societies had already endured generations of disruption. Settlers often refused to believe that the ancestors of living native peoples had created the monuments around them. The builders were pushed into an invented past, while indigenous nations were denied connection to their own achievements. Cahokia therefore vanished twice, first as a functioning city, and later from the historical narrative imposed upon the land. The first disappearance was a complex process of migration and political transformation. The second was an act of forgetting shaped by colonial assumptions. One scattered its people across living communities. The other falsely imagined that those people had ceased to exist. By the time grass covered the plazas and forest returned to abandoned neighborhoods, Cahokia's knowledge was already traveling elsewhere. It survived not as an untouched package, but in altered buildings, cultivated plants, ceremonies, symbols, political lessons, family traditions, and relationships to the land. The capital was empty, yet the human world that created it continued. Its descendants did not remain frozen beside the mounds, waiting to be recognized by archaeology. They moved forward through history, while the earthworks behind them waited centuries for outsiders to understand what they were seeing. For centuries after Cahokia ceased to function as a metropolis, its monuments remained visible without being understood by the people who settled around them. Trees grew across the abandoned precincts. Farmers cleared the land and planted crops over former neighborhoods. Roads crossed plazas whose original boundaries had faded from sight. The great mound still rose above the floodplain, but without timber buildings on its summit or crowds gathering below. It increasingly resembled a natural hill. Smaller earthworks were even easier to overlook. Some became property boundaries, convenient viewpoints, or sources of soil. Others vanished beneath plows before anyone carefully recorded their shape. European settlers encountered ancient mounds throughout the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, yet many refused to believe that the ancestors of living native peoples had built them. Instead, 19th century writers invented a vanished population known simply as the mound builders. Depending on the storyteller, these imagined builders were refugees from the ancient Mediterranean, wandering Israelites, lost Europeans, or members of another supposedly superior civilization destroyed before colonists arrived. The theories contradicted one another, but they shared a political purpose. By separating the monuments from indigenous people, settlers could admire the ruins while denying native nations a deep history of agriculture, engineering, government, and attachment to the land. Evidence against the myth had always been present. Early European accounts described native towns organized around plazas and platform mounds. Indigenous communities maintained traditions connected to mound construction and ceremonial landscapes. Artifacts found within ancient earthworks belonged clearly to North American technologies and cultural histories. By the late 19th century, systematic archaeological investigation demonstrated that the mounds were indigenous creations. The supposed vanished race had never existed. What had vanished was the willingness of colonial society to recognize native achievement. Cahokia's archaeological rediscovery unfolded slowly. Surveyors mapped surviving earthworks, collectors removed objects, and excavators opened trenches into mounds and residential areas. Early investigations sometimes caused as much damage as understanding. Burials were disturbed, artifacts were separated from their contexts, and excavation methods failed to record details that modern archaeologists would consider essential. Once a layer of soil is removed, It cannot be replaced exactly as it was. Archaeology is therefore a destructive form of reading, and every generation inherits both the discoveries and mistakes of those who dug before it. As methods improved, the invisible city began to return. Researchers learned to identify house walls through patterns of post holes, to distinguish storage pits from natural stains, and to reconstruct rebuilding episodes from overlapping structures. Pottery fragments revealed changing styles and connections. Plant remains exposed the importance of maize and native seed crops. Animal bones showed hunting, fishing, feasting, and craft production. Chemical analysis of teeth identified migrants. New dating techniques narrowed the chronology of Cahokia's extraordinary expansion. Geophysical surveys allowed archaeologists to detect buried structures without opening every patch of ground. The city that emerged from this work was far larger and more complex than early investigators had imagined. It contained planned plazas, residential districts, timber circles, workshops, causeways, palisades, burial precincts, and monuments repeatedly rebuilt across generations. Cahokia was no longer understood as a collection of ceremonial mounds surrounded by a few villages. It was recognized as the center of an urban landscape extending across the American bottom and influencing communities far beyond it. Yet the rediscovery came while destruction continued. Modern development spread across the floodplain during the 19th and 20th centuries. Roads, houses, businesses, and industrial facilities covered ancient settlement zones. Some mounds were leveled completely. Construction sliced through neighborhoods whose remains had survived for centuries beneath farmland. Across the Mississippi and St. Louis, nearly all the city's ancient mounds disappeared beneath expanding streets and buildings. The modern metropolis consumed much of the older one before its importance was widely accepted. Even the protected center was threatened. Highway construction brought major roads alarmingly close to the surviving mounds, cutting through parts of the broader archaeological landscape. The traffic now passing beside Cahokia creates an unsettling contrast. Vehicles cross the floodplain at speeds its builders could never have imagined, while Monk's Mound remains fixed above them. The roads make the site accessible, but they also demonstrate how narrowly some of it escaped destruction. Preservation efforts eventually secured the central group of earthworks as a state historic site, and international recognition followed. Today, the remaining mounds are treated as part of humanity's shared heritage. Visitors can climb Monk's Mound, walk reconstructed alignments, and look across parts of the Grand Plaza. Yet only a portion of the original metropolis lies within protected boundaries. Important remains survive beneath surrounding farmland and development. While others have already been lost, preservation is not a completed achievement but an ongoing negotiation between research, conservation, public access, private property, and urban growth. The interpretation of Cahokia has also changed. Older displays often presented the city as an isolated mystery whose builders disappeared without descendants. Current scholarship places greater emphasis on continuity, migration, and the living indigenous histories of the Mississippi Valley. Direct relationships between the archaeological population and specific modern nations remain complex, particularly after centuries of movement, warfare, colonial removal, and demographic catastrophe. Archaeologists cannot assign every Cahokian household to a later people. That uncertainty, however, does not justify separating the city from Native America. Indigenous perspectives increasingly shape how Cahokia is discussed, preserved, and understood. The mounds are not merely containers of scientific data. They include graves, sacred places, ancestral landscapes, and material traces of communities whose humanity must not be reduced to collections of bones and objects. Questions about excavation, reburial, museum display, and ceremonial access carry ethical consequences. Knowledge obtained from a burial can illuminate the past, but the dead were never placed in the ground for the convenience of future researchers. This recognition has encouraged a more careful form of archaeology. Scholars collaborate more often with native communities, reconsider older collections, and acknowledge that scientific interpretation is only one way of understanding a place. The process remains imperfect, and disagreements continue. Archaeology seeks evidence through excavation and analysis, while indigenous knowledge may preserve relationships, responsibilities, and meanings that do not fit easily into laboratory categories. Neither can simply be substituted for the other, but the history of Cahokia becomes poorer when living native voices are excluded. The city's recovery also transforms the broader history of urbanism. Cahokia demonstrates that a city does not require stone walls, metal tools, wheeled transport, written bureaucracy, or livestock to reach monumental scale. Urban life can be built from timber, soil, rivers, cultivated plants, ceremony, migration, and shared labour. Its architecture was perishable, but its political imagination was not simple. Its residents solved problems of food supply, public gathering, construction, social integration, and long-distance exchange, even as they created inequality and pressures they could not permanently control. The comparison with medieval London remains powerful not because the two cities were identical, but because they were different answers to similar human challenges. Both gathered thousands into crowded settlements. Both depended on surrounding farmers and distant networks. Both contained sacred precincts, political elites, disease, inequality, labour, spectacle, and danger. London continued growing and became central to a global empire. Cahokia declined, lost its name, and was nearly removed from written history. Survival shaped which city seemed important, not the scale of life once contained within it. Cahokia now returns not as a fantasy of a vanished race, but as an indigenous metropolis whose achievements and failures belong within the history of the Americas. Its people constructed the largest earthen monument on the continent north of Mexico, welcomed migrants from distant regions, organized ceremonies around the movements of the sun, and created a capital whose population rivaled famous cities across the ocean. They also lived with crowding, disease, political exclusion, sacrifice, environmental uncertainty, and the instability of concentrated power. The surviving mounds do not provide a complete answer to what Cahokia was. They offer something more honest, a landscape filled with evidence, absence, and continuing responsibility. Beneath the grass remain houses that have never been excavated, meals that survive only as burned seeds, and human choices visible only through patterns in the earth. Each discovery adds detail while reminding us how much has been destroyed or remains unknown. The forgotten capital has not surrendered all its secrets. It has simply become impossible to pretend that it was never there. The light over the American bottom changes slowly toward evening. Shadows lengthen across the terraces of Monk's Mound, softening the edges shaped by thousands of workers almost a millennium ago. From the summit, the modern world appears close and restless. Highways cross the plain. Buildings spread toward the horizon. The Mississippi continues beyond view, still moving through channels that have shifted repeatedly since the city was alive. There is little on the surface to show where families once slept, where potters shaped wet clay, or where migrants entered neighborhoods filled with unfamiliar voices. Smoke no longer rises from domestic hearths. The timber circles have become reconstructed posts and buried stains. The summit building is gone. Wind moves through grass where leaders once looked down upon a crowded plaza. Yet absence does not make the place empty. The soil still holds the pressure of houseposts, the charcoal of cooking fires, fragments of vessels, discarded tools, and the carefully placed dead. The mounds retain the weight of baskets carried by people whose names cannot be recovered. Their work remains present in every slope, though the reasons they laboured have become partly unreachable. Civilizations rarely vanish as completely as later stories suggest. Their governments fail, their monuments decay, and their populations move, but pieces of their world travel onward. They survive in crops, roots, ceremonies, political memories, and decisions not to rebuild what has become too costly. They also survive in landscapes whose meaning waits to be recognized again. Cahokia reminds us that forgetting is not the same as disappearance. A city can remain beneath roads and fields while history looks elsewhere. A people can endure while outsiders declare them vanished. An achievement can be dismissed because it was built from earth rather than stone, or because acknowledging its builders would disturb a convenient story. Long after the last roof collapsed, Monk's Mound continued to face the sky. Floods came and withdrew. Forests returned and were cleared again. New cities rose across the river. Generations crossed the plain without knowing what lay beneath them. And still the mound remained, holding its silence above the fields not as the grave of a lost world, but as the surviving shape of a human world that changed, scattered, and continued beyond the limits of memory.